talk about something that is really important to me, and as you can see, it's part of a number of talks I'm going to give on basic stuff. And the reality is that now that Symfony has a lot of core components, I would say all the components that I would have dreamed of 10 years ago, it's time to reinvent the way we are doing basic stuff, right? And there is a big difference in the ecosystem between what we had 5 years ago with Symfony 2.0 and today. And the very first thing I want to talk about is how to send emails. That's basic, right? And I suppose everybody here is sending emails, right? No? Yes? Who is not sending emails at all? No emails, nobody. See? That's a basic. How many of you use SwiftMailer? PHP mailer. Really? Okay, why not? But most of the people are using SwiftMailer because we have a tight integration with Symfony, we have a bundle, and everything you need to get started really fast. But the way we are sending emails today with Symfony is exactly the same as 5 years ago. Nothing changed, or not a lot. So the first thing is, I'm the maintainer of SwiftMailer, and I've been maintaining SwiftMailer for the last 10 years or so. But the code infrastructure is exactly the same as SwiftMailer version 4. So we are at version 6, but if you have a look at the core infrastructure, it is exactly the same as what we had a few years back. And actually, it is SwiftMailer 4 was released at the same time as Symfony 1.2. Right? Nobody wants to work with Symfony 1.2 anymore, right? So, but we are using SwiftMailer 6, which is exactly the same as the code back then. So the code is getting old, which means that SwiftMailer is not your average PHP code. It's very far from the best practice that we are using in Symfony, of course, or any modern PHP code, I would say. It's not a big problem because most developers, they don't care about the internal code of SwiftMailer because you're just using a few classes that are exposed, like creating a message and sending a message. That's all. Done. So it's not a big deal, except for me, the maintainer. That's really a nightmare. So it means that SwiftMailer is not really maintained anymore, in a sense. If you have a look at the code and at the GitHub repository, you can see that there is a lot of activity actually. So we are adding a lot of features. I'm going to talk about them in a minute, which means that it is somehow maintained, but the code does not evolve, and the core infrastructure does not evolve the way I would want to. It's getting better. We switched to PHP Unit a few years back. And with version 6 released last year, I tried to refactor some code. So I removed some interfaces. We had a bunch of useless interfaces in the code. Some cosmetic changes, for instance. There were a bunch of new instance methods everywhere. It's not needed anymore. In PHP 7, you can say new something, parentheses, and then call some method. So it's not needed anymore. But it's really, just small changes, I would say. I tried to do more than that, but it's such a mess, and I'm going to explain why, that whenever I started to really try to refactor the code, I gave up. And I tried at least 5 times during the last 5 years. Once a year, something like that. So the very first thing is, okay, it's not that important. We do not have namespaces. Who cares? I don't care. But if a library is not using namespaces nowadays, it's like it's not a good sign, right? You're not sending the good message. It's very odd, even if you should not care. Anyway, the second thing is more important. The sequence, the boot sequence, and the way we are actually bootstrapping the code is kind of weird. I'm going to talk about that. And then we have proprietary code, the dependency injection container, and even dispatcher. Even if the dependency injection container is more or less the same as Pimple, so it's not too different from Pimple, and even dispatcher is almost the same as the one we have in Symfony. Almost the same, but not exactly the same. Okay, so we are not really using the composer autoloader. We have our own way of doing things. So you can see on the left side of the screen the composer, the JSON file, where we are actually referencing a file, but you can see that there is no PSR0 or PSR4. That's because the way so the way we are actually managing the classes and the objects with the dependency injection container means that we need to bootstrap things. It's quite heavy, which means that we don't want to bootstrap SwiftMailer if you are not sending emails, right? So we don't want to bootstrap SwiftMailer on every single request. And the way we are doing that is that we are registering our own autoloader, and then we have an anonymous function doing the work. And the very first time you are using a Swift class, then we are running this anonymous function to bootstrap the library. Okay. Not using Composer means that, and you should not care because probably you were not aware of that fact, right? But the thing is, it means that we can't benefit from the Composer optimizations, for instance. So we can't have map, we don't have all those nice things that make things faster, especially in production. Okay, so that's about the problems. There is another one, and the other one is that the message instance is not a data object. So when you are creating a message, the message is about the properties of the message, to, from, subject, body, and things, but it's also about the logic to convert the message to a MIME message so that SwiftMailer can send it, which leads to some problems. So it's very difficult, not difficult, but if you are trying to serialize a message, it's very big. The payload is really big, because we embed a lot of things that are not related to the data object and the message that you want to send. So that's also a big problem. And then we have also the class inheritance, and that's why I was not able to refactor the code, because you have a class and then it extends another one and another one and another one, and all of a sudden your head explodes, really. Happened to me 5 times, once a year. So that's one example, and that's because SwiftMailer is using dependency injection to the extreme. And of course, when you are creating a message, we don't want you to inject other instances, an encoder, for instance. That doesn't make sense. So I want you to only manage your message properties, so the message body, the content type, the char set, things like that. But how do you inject the dependencies? And that's the way it is in SwiftMailer 6. So we have the Swift message class that extends the Swift MIME, whatever it's called, I can't read from here, simple MIME message or something like that. And you can see that we are calling the constructor, and then we are using the dependency injection container as a singleton to get the dependencies. Awful, right? That's the way it works. So whenever you have one class in SwiftMailer, you have another one with this trick. So that's also why we have a bunch of Swift something, simple something. That's the kind of classes that we have. So which means that also when you are using SwiftMailer with Symfony, we are actually using 2 dependency injection containers. One from SwiftMailer, and that's the one here for messages, But for everything related to the transport, the way we are sending emails, we are using a Symfony dependency injection container. So that's kind of a mess. Okay, that's the state of SwiftMailer in 2018. I would not recommend to switch to PHP mailer if that's what you had in mind. Have a look at the code. Okay, anyway. But of course, SwiftMailer is also a great library to send emails. We have a bunch of great features. The plugin system is great. It's based on the dependency, the event dispatcher. So we have great plugins that you are probably using to be able to not send emails in the development environment and things like that. Very nice. We have a bunch of authentication methods. Probably SwiftMailer is the only one to support so many different strategies. Signing, encrypting, SMTP pipelining, that's something new, probably done in the last 6 months or so. Support for UTF-8, internationalization of domain names and things like that. So we have a bunch of great features and don't want to lose them, of course. I want them to be part of the new initiative I'm going to talk about. And again, not so great features. And one of them is over-engineering. And dependency injection is one of them. And spools. Spools is another problem. So spools is a way to defer sending emails to later on, right? So you don't want to send emails directly in the controller. So you can use a spool to defer sending the emails. Doesn't work very well. If you have a look at the GitHub repository, we'll see that we have a bunch of issues about that. Not really able to fix them because it's kind of a mess. And again, we don't have that many possibilities here as we are using a file system for the spool storage. So it's not easy to get to the next level, really. Okay, so and here, and of course, we have missing features. And features you won't find easily anywhere else anyway, but most of you are probably using Twig in emails, but we don't have a tight integration. So you can find a lot of blog posts on the internet explaining how you can use Twig and SwiftMailer together, but it's not built in. It's not part of the bundle. There is nothing that eases the usage of Twig with SwiftMailer. And then SwiftMailer only supports SMTP, which is okay. But nowadays, you should probably use a provider for various reasons, like spam and SPF and a lot of different reasons. And so, if you are using SMTP on your local machine and you are using an API in production, you can't use a SwiftMailer, except if you are using the SMTP transport from the provider, but that's kind of a mess. So I wanted to have something where you can use SMTP or a provider via their API. Okay, so let me introduce you to Symfony Mailer, which is a new component I've been working on for the last month. And with the new component, I'm trying to fix all the problems I've just talked about. And at the same time, I'm trying to also keep everything that is great about SwiftMailer. So Symfony Mailer, and that's exactly the same as for SwiftMailer, is only for transactional emails. If you are sending a newsletter, for instance, don't use SwiftMailer, don't use the Symfony Mailer, use whatever, MailChimp, Campaign Monitor, or whatever. There are a lot of providers there. So at some point we might have support for that, but that's not the case right now. We are really focused on sending transactional emails. So I want Symfony Mailer to be optimized for the emails that you are sending all the time, right? When someone wants to reset a password, for instance, or sending an invoice or things like that, typical email, I would say. So you have one recipient, you have a subject, you have a body, probably one attachment, and that's all, really. So very simple stuff. So basic way of sending emails, so nothing fancy here. The big difference here is that we are creating a new email, not a message. I think it's a small change here. The name is different, but I think it's important to convey what we are doing here. We are creating a new email. And yes, email is a data object here. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then you have a bunch of things going on here. You can see that we have some shortcuts like set text body or set HTML body. And if you want to attach a file, by default, we take a file name, that's all. You don't need to create a new object. You can, if you want to set a different content type or a different curl set, for instance, that's a possibility. But by default, what you want to do on a day-to-day basis is really easy. And so we simplified the API a lot. Okay, and then we also simplify the way you are actually creating a transport. So you create a message, then you want to send a message, and here you can see that we have this from DSN method, which means that by default, and that's part of the component. With SwiftMailer, you can use a DSN, but that's part of the bundle. So it only works if you are using the bundle, the SwiftMailer bundle. It doesn't work if you are using SwiftMailer standalone. Here, it's part of the component, so you create a transport with a DSN, and then you are sending the email. Talking about email transports, we have a bunch of them. So, of course, you can create a SMTP transport for local development, that works. But then we have a bunch of them. So, as you can see, we have this Symfony component mailer transport namespace. And we have a bunch of shortcuts. If you want to send an email via Gmail or Mailgun or SendGrid, whatever, this is using the SMTP transport, right? So it's a very thin layer on top of the standard and the default SMTP transport class. As you can see, some of the transport are using user and passwords. For SendGrid, you only have a key. For Postmark, you have an ID. So it's very small abstraction. Nothing huge here, but nice nonetheless. That's for SMTP. The second one, and the second namespace is transport HTTP. Exactly the same as before, except that now we are using the HTTP API, not the API, the HTTP transport to send the email. But here, it is still the responsibility of the Symfony mailer component to actually convert your message to a MIME message, which means that if you are switching from a local SMTP server in development to the mailgun transport via HTTP, the message is going to be exactly the same, right? And then we have HTTP API, and now we are using the HTTP transport, but we are using the API of the provider, and the provider is responsible for converting your message to a MIME message, which means that now the message can be different if you are using an SMTP server on your local machine and using these kind of things in production. Okay, cool. And of course, that's a lot of classes with kind of the same name, so having a DSN really help having something easy to understand. So here are some examples, SMTP for Gmail, or using HTTP or API, things like that, right? So that's a great way to also use the mailer with Symfony 4, because now you can use an environment variable for the DSN and the different environments that you have. And again, it's not part of the semantic configuration of Symfony, but really part of the component itself. I wanted to go further than that. So it means that, so we have two nice features in SwiftMailer, and we do have the same in the mailer component, and that's failover and a load balanced transport. So failover basically is that if you want to send an email, you try to use one transport, here the Postmark API, and if that doesn't work, then we can fall back to SendGrid via SMTP. Just an example. And the load balance one is a bit different. It uses one or the other. You can have a bunch of them. You can have 3, 4, 5 of them. The load balance one is great if you want to benefit from the free tier of the providers, right? Why not? Okay. Anyway, next one. Okay, so the great thing about having a way to use SMTP, HTTP, and APIs is that everything is unified and the behavior is the same, exactly the same. It does not depend on the transport, which means that you have the same events, right? So we have I don't remember, before send message, we have an after send message, we have a message when there is an exception and things like that. So if you have a plugin, the plugin is going to work for all transports, from SMTP to API. Unified DSN, that's great for environment variables. You can switch from SMTP to a real provider in production. You are going to use the same API and the same serialization. This one is great. The fact that we have a data object that we can serialize really easily, and we are serializing our message, means that load balanced transport and the failover transport, they work out of the box with any provider out there, right? The abstraction is exactly the same. And of course, there is one drawback, which is that you can't really use the advanced features of your provider, like tagging and things like that, because, of course, it doesn't work everywhere. We might add some specific stuff for things that are common in all APIs, like tagging, for instance, but that's not part of the code for now. Okay, so that's the basics. Now, here, the message, we have a very simple text body, but I want to go fancy here and use Twig. If you want to do that, that's how you can do that. Not using an email anymore, you are using a templated email, and then now you have a set template and done. That's how you can use Twig with SymfonyMailer. And the template looks like this. 3 blocks, the subject, the text, HTML, everything is optional. And it works really well with recent versions of Twig, because now the fact that you can, so the way it works is that we do not render this template. We are asking Twig to render each block independently, and then we inject the result into the message, right? And that's supported in Twig, in the recent version of Twig. So it worked before, but it was not officially supported. Now it works really well, and as a matter of fact, I added the support for this possibility just because of that. If you want to embed an image, there is a function for that. So you can say email image, and then the image is going to be embedded directly into the message, right? Embedded means that it's not an attachment anymore. I mean, it's an attachment, but it doesn't look like an attachment in the client, right? You can pass some context. For instance, here I'm passing my name, and then you can use email.context.name in your template, and you will see why it is email.context.name. Oh, I can explain it now. Email is actually your email object, right? So depending on the class you are using, you have more features available directly in your templates, like the context here for templated emails. So if you are using just email, you don't have a context. Okay, that's nice. That's a way you can actually use HTML, but we know that, you know, HTML emails is kind of hard. Compatibility with all the clients, inlining CSS, having a responsive layout and things, it's very complex. Which means that I wanted to abstract that so that you don't need to care about those kind of things. So I looked around for a good responsive template, and I found one. So by default, we are using a responsive templates really, and default style sheets from Postmark. It's MIT license, so no big deal. It's not exactly the same because I converted those templates to Twig. And of course, I added support for Encore. And that's a great example of how we can leverage the new features of Symfony in such a situation. So here, the style sheets are managed directly by Symfony, and then we are using the Symfony CSS selector to actually inline all the style in HTML. Okay, so let's see how that works. So now we are using a themed email, which extends the templated email. We are still using a template, but the template is a bit different now. The layout is where the magic happens. So we are extending a template now, which means that we don't have an HTML block anymore. We have a content block, right? So the subject is exactly the same. The text one is exactly the same, but now for the HTML, we only care about the content. We do not care about the layout anymore because that's part of the layout. So if we render this email, it looks like this, right? On the left side of the screen. And if you have a look at the email, you can see that some of the things there are not part of the template because there is a configuration that you can use to abstract a lot of things. So like the company name, the product name, and things like that. Okay? So that's configurable, of course, but it's built in and you can use that out of the box. And the settings, they work also without the full stack framework. So everything I'm going to talk about today is really part of the component. It's not so much about the bundle. The bundle is really just about wiring everything together, so it works well with Symfony full stack. Okay, now that we have a style, you can use simple HTML like this, or you can use Markdown, for instance, right? And you will get exactly the same. That works well because we have style sheets, so all of a sudden we don't care about adding more styles directly into the tags. You can have a button like that, so we have a bunch of email tags, like email button here. You pass the URL and yeah, so here the text is not the same in the button, so that's not exactly the same, but I think it was because it doesn't fit on the slide, so that's why I've just Google and go to Google. Below, you can change the color and things. Okay, so you get the point. And we have some abstraction, so we have a container, for instance, just a box in gray. It's really extracted from Postmark, nothing I invented here. You can use Markdown, and that's very nice if you want to embed a table, for instance, like this. And we have boxes. Okay. So that's a bunch of abstraction on top of the Postmark templates that really make it easy to have nice emails without doing anything. Right? It just works out of the box. Okay, so that's the first way to use Symfony Mailer. You create an email and you are calling a bunch of methods, right? Set to, set from, set subject, set template, whatever. But you can also create a class, if that makes sense. That's another possibility. So here, you can see that instead of using directly the email, we have, and again, it works really well because it is just a data object, right? So just a bunch of getters and setters, that's all. Okay. And so remember, the email object or the email variable in the template is really the email object. So just because I have added a getter and a setter here to be more precise on email, then when you create your promotion email, then you can set the discount rate and get it directly in the email via email.discount rate. There is nothing magic here, it is just because we are using twig and a data object, that's all, right? But it's nice. I think it is. The next step is that I wanted to abstract basic emails, right? You don't need to reinvent the way of sending a password reset email. So if you want to, or you know, if you are doing a prototype, for instance, at first you can use the password reset email that comes with the bundle, with the component actually. And then we have specific setters and getters there, and it renders like this. There are a bunch of options you can add, the browser and whatnot. There are a bunch of things you can do here. Okay, so that's all for how you can compose emails. So remember, that's a data object, email class. You can use templates, works really great. And as you can see, you don't have to do anything. You set a template, you do not care about how it's rendered. It's rendered directly because you are using the right class. That's all. So that's a plugin, actually. That's the equivalent of a SwiftMailer plugin that is doing the work. The next feature I want to talk about, and that's brand new, that's how we can replace the spool system of SwiftMailer. So how can we go async? And I think you know how to do that, because now we have the messenger component in Symfony. So why not leverage that component? So instead of doing that, instead of creating a transport and then sending the email via the transport, that's something you will never ever do, actually. You will always do bus dispatch email. So you dispatch the email on the bus. Here, if you don't know what a bus is, not a big deal, not a problem. I'm going to explain that with my own words. No, design pattern or anything, just very simple. So basically, if you're in a controller and you want to send a message, instead of injecting a mailer, you ask for a bus, and you don't care about what this is. And then instead of sending the email on the mailer, or the transport really, you dispatch the email. That's all. So from your perspective, it's almost the same, right? Not the same object, not the same method. But if you are doing that, it gives you a lot of power. Because by default, the email is going to be sent right away, right? So this is exactly the same as before, as using the transport, no difference. But if you want to go async, which means that using that, you don't need AMQP, you don't need RabbitMQ, you don't need a Redis store or whatever, you need nothing. The email is going to be sent synchronously. But if you want to go async, in production for instance, you don't need to change your code, it's just a piece of configuration. So here, you can see that at the top of the screen, for the email instance, I'm saying that I want to route that with AMQP. And if I command that, it's sent immediately. So that's great because without changing your code, it is just a matter of configuration. So on your laptop, the emails can be sent directly, so you don't need AMQP, you don't need anything. And then when you switch to production, just uncomment the line and bam, you can use something else. That's great. That's great. And the great thing is, so it means that you don't need to say here, delay the message or send later or whatever. It's not your responsibility to do that. And one question might be, okay, but sometimes I want to send an email immediately and some other time I want to delay that or send it to a queue. That's also possible. Just create a class. Just create a send later email class and configure that directly here instead of the main email message. That's a possibility. So it's really flexible. And the great thing about the system is that this is all the code in the mailer component to make it work, right? So the glue between Symfony mailer and Symfony messenger to make it work is really, what, 5 lines of code. That's all. So we have a handler, and then we tag the handler properly, done. Everything else is part of the messenger component, that's all. Okay, I think you get the point now. Okay, at this point I'd like to talk a bit about the messenger component because I like it very much. I think it's the same kind of revolution that we had 5 years ago when I introduced the dependency injection container. And when we introduced the dependency injection container, all of a sudden, we had a lot of opportunities, a lot of possibilities that were not possible before. And it was kind of complex to understand why it was very difficult to do things, and the container unlocked a lot of things, magically, I would say. And I think the same is going to happen with the messenger component. And if you have a look at the code, it's really small. So, you know, it's about big words, right? You have a bus, you handle the message, and you have design patterns behind that. I don't care, you should not care. I mean, you can read stuff about that, but use the messenger component, you don't care. Because basically, if you have a look at this and that, okay, let's take an example. You have a controller. You send an email, and you want to log the message, the email as well. So you have two lines. Mailer send email and log something. You are doing that in several methods in the controller. So you want to refactor the code. So you are creating a protected method, right? So that you don't have to repeat the code everywhere. First step. The second step is you have more than one controller doing the same. So you create an abstract class, for instance, or a trait or whatever, and you move the protected method there. Okay? But now, if you want to use the same abstraction in controllers and in services, for instance, then you need a proper object to do that. Right? So you create a class, and you have a method to be able to send an email and log the email. Right? This class can be a handler. Right? That's exactly what we have here. The only responsibility of this class is we give it an email, and we are saying, okay, do something with the email. So here we can send the email and then log the email as well. If you are doing that, and you can see that there is no interface or whatever, if you are doing that, instead of calling the handler directly in your method, you can dispatch it via the bus. That's all. Right? But the big difference is that now, just because you are delegating the handler method call to the bus, you can go async. Just a matter of configuration for your own classes. So I'm not saying that you need to do that all the time, but sometimes it's really nice to be able to do that really easily. Okay. But of course, sending emails is the easy part, right? And that's probably the great thing about providers. When you have your own SMTP server, first it is a nightmare to maintain, then you have a bunch of problems with spams and whatnot, and being blacklisted and things like that, delivery and things, but also you need to be able to manage bounces. How many of you have ever tried to manage bounces directly from their own SMTP servers? Nightmare, right? Just not possible. That's, we don't want to do that anyway. That doesn't make sense. So we have providers. So I also wanted to have some kind of abstraction on top of all the providers so that we can easily manage bounces, whatever transport you're using, except the local SMTP server, of course. So what we have here is that we have a controller in charge of that. So what you can do is you can mount the routes from the bundle, from the mailer bundle, like I've done here. And we can't do that automatically because some providers, they don't have, and that's, I don't understand why, but they don't have an authentication mechanism for the API. Which means they have an authentication system, but if you send a message, there is no signature. So you can't check that it is a message coming from the provider. So I know that, security by obfuscating the URL is not that great, but there is no other way. So I would recommend you to use a provider using some kind of signature because we are checking that on our side. But that's the best we can do. So first step, you mount this controller, and that's all. And of course, you reference the URL directly with the provider so that you can call this URL whenever there is something going on behind the scenes. If you are doing that, then we are going to start receiving some messages from the provider, and we are going to trash them directly because you don't care, right? But if you care about something, then you create a handler. Because of course, in the controller, we are just dispatching the message. And then it's your responsibility to do something about them. So here I'm interested in the failure webhook, which is hard bounces, actually, right? So here I'm just logging the message, that's all. But that's the only thing you need to do. You create a class, you implement the message under interface, and then you type it with the webhook you're interested in, and you are doing whatever you want. And if you are using Symfony 4, the dependency injection container is going to figure out what you need. Here I need a logger, so you don't need to do any configuration whatsoever. So it's really just create this class, and you are going to start receiving the messages, and you are going to see in the logs the failures directly, right? I like that a lot. And it's possible because we have the dependency injection container auto-wiring thing, we have the messenger component, we have a bunch of things that makes it possible now. It was not possible 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago. Because you would have had to configure a lot of things, a lot of settings in YAML files and whatnot. Think of the past. Don't need to do that anymore. Everybody is familiar with Symfony 4 and Symfony Flags? Yes? Yes, okay, cool. And so here, it's going to be done in a synchronous way, right? Remember, a handler by default, that's synchronous. You want to do that asynchronously? Done. Right? Again, just a matter of configuring which transport you want to use for the messages. So here I have AMQP, which is the only one right now, right? More or less. You can also use NQ if you want to have more transport, but we are probably going to have more in Symfony 4 too with Redis support. Yes? Probably. That's cool. Okay, so again, the Symfony mailer tries to use a bunch of things coming from the Symfony ecosystem. So we talked about Twig, Encore, the serializer, that's how we are actually serializing the messages in the queues, Messenger, PSR logger, CSS selector, event dispatcher, dependency injection container, the one from Symfony, the polyfills, also for internationalization of domain names, ENTL, and of course all the features from Symfony, SwiftMailer 6. So the transport layer is more or less the same as SwiftMailer 6. All the plugins from SwiftMailer 6 have been converted to event listeners in Symfony Mailer. So basically you have everything you have and you love in SwiftMailer 6 in a new package. And the package is much nicer, hopefully, than what we had in SwiftMailer 6. So working on that, I realized that I needed some more things that were not yet available in the ecosystem, which means that when I'm going to release Symfony Mailer, it's going to be composed of 3 components and 1 bundle. So a bundle to do the wiring between the components and the full stack framework. And the three components, the first one is MIME. So Symfony MIME, I don't know how it's going to be called, but everything you need to create MIME messages, the first one. The second one is going to be about the transport. Oh, I did not talk about that, but there is no mailer class in Symfony Mailer. You are using the transport directly. Or you're not using transport, you're using the bus. But anyway, there is no big mailer class. So the second component is about the transport, and the third one is one that I won't talk about today, but it's going to be part 2 of Back to the Basics, and I'm going to talk about that probably in less than a month. We're going to organize an online conference to be able to talk about that one. And if everything goes fine, it's going to be part of Symfony 4.3. Okay, I think I'm done for today. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions. Questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
About custom headers. I know you mentioned this is not focused for a newsletter, it's more for transactional.
Yeah.
But the possibility of adding custom headers, let's say, on the getter and setter, or maybe in Twig template, is that something?
Okay, so you have the same possibilities that you have with SwiftMailer right now. So the my message component is actually exactly the same as SwiftMailer version 6, except that we removed all the craft and we moved to namespaced classes and things like that. So you have the exact same features. So if you want to set some headers and whatever you want to do, that's totally possible. The only thing is that by default, the API is simpler than the one you get from SwiftMailer right now. So Symfony Mailer is not really about removing features, it's more about adding a nice abstraction on top of what we already have. And in the process, trying to make the code better under the hood.
Where would you handle the ability for, with your different email providers, for the click handling? They rewrite it for analytic purposes. Is that factored into the template? Are you separate from the transport?
Okay, so it's not done yet, but if you want to work on that. Yeah, so everything I've talked about today on the slides, not on the last one, I mean, it was not the last one, that works on my laptop and on one server. That's 2 machines. That's a lot already. But of course, it's not finished yet.
By induction, though, it works on.
So, yeah, exactly. So, I think I have full support for Mailgun right now and Postmark. I don't have full support for SendGrid, for instance. And I think when I'm going to release the code, it's not going to be fully featured because I think all of you can help me do the SendGrid transport or whatever and clicks and things like that. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but because I understand what you're talking about. Bounces was probably the most important one for me. So I'm not saying we are going to abstract everything, and if that doesn't work well because we can't really make it happen on our side, then we can give up. Yeah, I mean, that's also a possibility. But if we can have an abstraction that works well with all the providers, I would like to add that directly into the component, if possible. Okay. Thanks again. Enjoy the conference. See you around.